She set the plate down on the counter, chipped beef swimming in white gravy over toast, and not one customer blinked. 15 meals used to be diner standards. Today, you could search every menu in your town and not find a single one. The American diner grew out of a horse-drawn lunch wagon in Providence, Rhode Island, back in 1872, feeding night-shift newspaper workers coffee and sandwiches when nothing else was open. By the 1930s and 40s, prefabricated diner cars from builders like Worcester Lunch Car Company were rolling into small towns across the country, and the menu that came with them was nothing like what survives today. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. The blue plate special was the heart of it, one meat and two sides served on a single plate for a set low price, and the cooks behind those counters built entire menus around dishes that took real skill and no shortcuts. Cream sauces made from a roux, offal handled with confidence, mock ingredients that fooled a whole dining room. None of it survives on a modern menu. The post-war boom years, roughly 1946 through 1960, are where this list really lives. Interstate highway growth and a wave of suburban commuting sent diners multiplying across the country, and the menus of that decade and a half hold the fullest expression of everything we're about to walk through. This isn't guesswork or a single family story. It's what counters actually served, night after night, coast to coast. Let's start with the dish that built a reputation entirely on shared memory. Creamed chipped beef on toast, the plate soldiers called SOS, was standard mess hall food long before it ever reached a diner counter. Millions of men came home from the Second World War having eaten it in service, and when they sat down at a lunch counter in 1946, they ordered it on purpose because it tasted like something they recognized. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works as a story about how food carries memory. Dried, salted beef shaved thin, folded into a peppery white sauce, poured over toasted white bread. Simple ingredients, real technique in the roux. A cook had to keep that sauce moving over low heat, or it would break, thin out, and lose the whole texture that made the dish worth ordering twice. Diners served chipped beef on toast through the 1960s and into the 70s, and then the generation that remembered the mess hall got older, and nobody ordered it for nostalgia anymore. Fewer young cooks knew how to build the sauce, fewer young customers had any memory attached to the plate, and a dish that had survived on shared experience simply ran out of people who shared it. Next came a dish that most people today would never order, but diners across the country served it as a respected weekly special. Liver and onions, pan seared until just past pink, smothered in soft caramelized onions, was not cheap filler. It was a dish home economists praised and cooks took pride in getting right, and plenty of diners built loyal regulars around it. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Get the pan hot, don't crowd the liver, let the onions go low and slow until they're nearly caramel. Overcook the liver even a minute too long, and the whole plate turned tough and bitter, which is exactly why a good liver and onions cook earned real respect from the rest of the kitchen. It stayed on menus into the 1970s and 80s in some diners, a genuinely popular order, before changing tastes and fewer home cooks learning the technique pushed it off menus for good. Organ meat in general started carrying a stigma it never used to have, and liver, once a proud weekly special, became something most modern diners would never even think to put on a chalkboard. Here's one whose name confuses everyone the first time they hear it. Welsh rarebit has nothing to do with rabbit meat at all. It's a thick sauce of melted cheese and ale poured hot over toast, and the name is believed to come from a satirical 18th-century English joke about poor Welsh farmers substituting cheese for meat they couldn't afford. Diners and tea rooms served it as a common lunch item well into the 1950s and 60s. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Welsh rarebit needed a cook who understood how to keep cheese sauce from breaking over heat, whisking constantly, adding the cheese slowly, never letting it boil. That small technical skill just isn't taught anymore outside of professional kitchens. And when it faded from home cooking, the dish faded from diner counters right alongside it. Today, you'd struggle to find Welsh rarebit on any menu in the country, diner or otherwise. It survives mostly in old cookbooks and in a handful of British-style pubs that keep it around as a novelty item rather than an everyday lunch order the way American diners once treated it. This next one actually traveled backward compared to most forgotten dishes. Chicken a la king, rich cream sauce studded with mushroom and pimento poured over toast or rice, started as an upscale item in fine New York hotel dining rooms in the late 1800s. By the mid-20th century, it had trickled all the way down to the diner counter, a fancy dish democratized into everyday lunch fare. By the 1950s, chicken a la king was a reliable diner special, the kind of dish a waitress could describe in one sentence and know the whole counter would nod along. It took a properly made cream sauce, not a shortcut gravy, and that single requirement is probably why it quietly disappeared once fewer diner kitchens kept a cook who could build a sauce from scratch every single day. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works as a lesson in how convenience food eventually replaced scratch cooking on diner menus. Once packaged sauce mixes and frozen entrees became cheap and fast in the 1960s and 70s, a labor-intensive dish like chicken a la king simply couldn't compete with something a cook could heat and serve in half the time. Now for the dish with the most famous paper trail in American food history. Mock apple pie contains no apples at all. It's built from broken Ritz crackers simmered in a sugar and lemon syrup until the texture and flavor genuinely mimic cooked fruit. Nabisco printed the recipe directly on the cracker box starting in the 1930s, and diners across the country served slices of it without a single customer knowing the difference. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. Sugar rationing during the Second World War made mock apple pie especially practical, since crackers and syrup stretched further than real fruit filling when apples were scarce or expensive. Home cooks and diner cooks use the exact same printed recipe, which makes this one of the only forgotten dishes with a literal traceable origin instead of a story passed down by word of mouth. Diner desserts leaned on pie generally, since fruit fillings used less sugar than cream-based desserts during those rationed years. That single wartime constraint shaped what diner dessert cases looked like for a full decade afterward, long after rationing ended, because customers had come to expect the pie case first and everything else second. Mock apple pie eventually disappeared for a strange reason. Once fresh apples became cheap and available year-round through modern shipping and storage, there was no practical need for the trick anymore. The clever workaround that had once impressed an entire dining room quietly stopped being clever the moment the shortage it solved was gone. This next one takes a little courage to picture on a plate today. Beef tongue, sliced thin like corned beef, was a common cold cut on diner counters and deli sandwich boards. Cooks who still prepare it describe the meat as tender and mild, closer to corned beef than most people expect, but it vanished mostly because of squeamishness about a visibly recognizable organ, not because of how it tasted. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. A tongue sandwich on rye with mustard was ordinary lunch counter fare in plenty of American cities through the 1950s and 60s, sitting right next to pastrami and corned beef on the same menu board. It required a cook comfortable braising and slicing organ meat, and once that comfort faded from home kitchens, the sandwich faded from counters right along with it. By the 1970s, packaged deli meats and processed cold cuts had taken over most sandwich boards, and tongue quietly slipped off the list along with several other organ meats that required a butcher's confidence rather than a factory slicer. Once the name itself started sounding unfamiliar to a new generation of customers, ordering it became something people simply stopped doing. Here's one that surprises people every time. Diners served scooped cottage cheese with a canned peach half or a ring of pineapple as a defined lunch category, marketed specifically to women watching their weight. It was one of the earliest mainstream diet plates in American restaurant history, decades before any menu used the word light or light. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works as a window into how diners once served two entirely different customers on the same menu. One side of the board fed the working man his blue plate special of liver or Salisbury steak, and right next to it sat the lady's lunch plate of cottage cheese and fruit, both printed on the very same laminated menu without any separation. That diet plate category quietly evolved into the modern salad bar and lighter fare sections most restaurants keep today, but the specific pairing of cottage cheese with canned fruit vanished almost entirely, replaced first by yogurt cups and eventually by prepackaged salads that bear no resemblance to the plate a 1950s waitress would have set down. Now picture dropping a nickel into a little glass door and pulling out a plate of creamed spinach without ever seeing a waitress. That was Horn and Hardart, the Automat chain that started in Philadelphia in 1902 and expanded into New York by 1912. At its 1950s peak, it fed hundreds of thousands of people daily, and creamed spinach was one of its signature offerings. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Behind that wall of little glass doors was a full working kitchen, refilling each compartment by hand as customers emptied them. Creamed spinach, baked beans, and macaroni and cheese all came out of those slots, and a cook station just behind the wall watched constantly to make sure no compartment ever sat empty for long. When the last automat closed its doors in 1991, that entire style of serving food essentially left the American menu for good. It wasn't just a restaurant closing, it was a whole method of feeding a city, nickel by nickel, glass door by glass door, disappearing all at once, and creamed spinach the automat way went right along with it. Baked beans deserve their own mention here, because the automat version was thick, slow-simmered, and served as a genuine standalone plate rather than a side dish squeezed onto the edge of something else. That's almost unheard of today. Nobody orders a plate of baked beans as their whole lunch anymore, but in the 1940s and 50s it was a completely normal, filling, respected order. Macaroni and cheese, cafeteria and automat style, baked in a deep pan and cut into thick squares rather than scooped soft, was another standalone lunch plate rather than a side. It held its shape when sliced, almost like a casserole, and that dense baked texture is something almost nobody makes at home or serves in a restaurant the same way today. That baked, sliceable style of macaroni and cheese survives faintly in a few southern soul food kitchens today, but the version most restaurants serve now is soft and creamy, scooped straight from a pot. The dense, structural, cut into squares macaroni that fed an automat line all afternoon has almost entirely disappeared from American menus. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. Now for a dish that unsettles modern diners just from its name. Beef heart, braised low and slow until tender, then sliced and pan-seared, was a regular blue plate item in working-class and immigrant neighborhood diners. It wasn't shock food or a novelty. It was considered ordinary, economical protein, and cooks handled it with the same confidence they'd give a pot roast. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works as a reminder of how differently people once thought about a whole animal. Braising heart low and slow breaks down its dense muscle fiber into something genuinely tender, a technique passed countercook to countercook rather than written into any cookbook most households owned. When fewer cooks learned it, the dish simply stopped appearing on order pads. By the time industrial meat processing scaled up in the 1960s and 70s, packing plants were built around muscle cuts that moved fast and predictably through a supply chain, not around organ meats that needed a skilled cook at the other end. Beef heart didn't vanish because anyone decided against it. It simply stopped being profitable to keep in wide distribution. Scrapple takes the same nose-to-tail thinking even further. It's a loaf of cornmeal mixed with pork scraps and broth, chilled until firm, then sliced and pan-fried crisp on the outside. It was a breakfast diner staple, especially across Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic, and it's one of the few dishes on this list that still survives in small pockets today, mostly in diners near where it originated. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Scrapple used literally everything from the hog that couldn't be sold as a cut of meat, ground down and stretched with cornmeal into something that fed a family for days. It's a direct descendant of German Pennsylvania Dutch cooking, brought to America by settlers in the region well before the diner era even began. Its survival in a handful of regional diners today, mostly in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, makes Scrapple the rare exception on this entire list. Ask for it in most other parts of the country, and a waitress won't know what you mean, which tells you just how regional so many of these forgotten dishes actually were, even at their national peak. Salisbury steak needs a mention too, though it survives faintly in the frozen food aisle, stripped of everything that made the diner version worth ordering. The real diner plate was a hand-formed ground beef patty, seasoned with onion and seared hard, smothered in a proper brown gravy made from the pan drippings, not a packet. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. That pan gravy, built from the fond left behind after searing the patty, took real attention and couldn't be rushed. The frozen version that carries the name today skips every part of that process, which is exactly why it tastes like a different dish entirely, wearing the same name as something it never actually was. Frozen dinner companies borrowed the Salisbury steak name deliberately in the 1950s and 60s, since it already sounded familiar and comforting to shoppers who'd eaten it at diner counters. It's a strange twist where the frozen imitation ended up outliving the original scratch-made dish it was named after, and most people today have only ever tasted the imitation. Now for the plate that came smothered from end to end. The hot beef or hot turkey sandwich, open-faced on white bread and drowned entirely in gravy, mashed potatoes stacked right on the same plate and drowned too, was a diner lunch counter classic through the 1950s and 60s. It was hearty, cheap to make, and nearly impossible to eat with your hands, which was exactly the point. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. That single plate, sandwich and potatoes and gravy all touching, was efficient for a busy lunch counter. One plate, one gravy boat, minimal cleanup between orders. It's almost never served that way now. Modern versions plate the components separately, which changes the whole experience of eating it. The gravy itself mattered as much as the meat underneath it, made from real pan drippings and thickened by hand at the stove between orders. A busy counter cook could turn out dozens of these plates in an hour, and the fact that it required almost no plating skill, just a ladle and a steady hand, made it one of the most efficient dishes a diner kitchen could serve. Savory Jell-O salads round out this list, and they might be the strangest to modern eyes. Lime gelatin set with shredded carrot or cabbage suspended inside it, sometimes with canned fruit, sat on diner-side plates through the 1950s and 60s, tied directly to Jell-O's aggressive marketing of the era. It sounds unbelievable today, but it was a completely standard order. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works as proof of how far a single company's marketing could reshape an entire era's plate. Jell-O printed recipe booklets, ran magazine ads, and sponsored radio programs pushing savory molds into both home kitchens and diner menus at the same time, treating a gelatin salad as something genuinely elegant rather than a novelty. When that marketing push faded in the 1970s, the savory Jell-O salad essentially vanished with it. It's one of the clearest examples on this entire list of a dish that lived and died by advertising rather than by taste or practicality, which says something important about how much influence a single brand could have over the American dinner table. It's worth pausing here to notice a pattern across everything we've covered. Chipped beef, liver and onions, Welsh rarebit, chicken a la king, mock apple pie, tongue, cottage cheese plates, automat creamed spinach and beans and macaroni, beef heart, scrapple, Salisbury steak, hot beef sandwiches, and Jell-O salads. That's already 13 dishes, and every one of them required either real technique, real thrift, or both. Calf's brains and eggs, scrambled together at breakfast, round out the 14th entry, and it might be the one modern viewers find hardest to picture on a menu at all. It was served in working class and immigrant-heavy diners as regular breakfast protein, not shock food, and cooks who made it soaked the brains first and handled them with the same routine care they gave any other ingredient on the line. That dish disappeared for the same reasons as beef heart and tongue. Fewer butchers sold organ meat by the counter, fewer home cooks learned to prepare it, and a generation raised on packaged, muscle-cut protein lost the frame of reference for treating it as ordinary. It's not that anyone decided it was dangerous, it simply stopped being available, and then it stopped being remembered. That brings us to the 15th, and it's the plate that ties everything else together. A full blue plate special itself, liver or Salisbury steak with two sides chosen from a short rotating list, all on one plate for one set low price, was the actual engine of the whole diner business model. Every other dish on this list either fed into it or sat alongside it on the same laminated menu. That format itself, one set plate for one set price, is almost gone from American restaurants now. Menus today price every item separately, encourage upsells, and rarely offer a true fixed combination the way a 1950s diner did automatically every single day without ever calling it a special deal. It was just how lunch worked. 15 dishes, and every single one of them tells you something true about the era that made them. Rationing shaped the pie case. Military memory shaped the chipped beef. Marketing shaped the Jell-O molds. Nothing on this list was random. Every plate answered a real pressure the kitchen was working under, and that's worth remembering the next time somebody calls this era's food old-fashioned instead of resourceful. None of these dishes disappeared because they were unhealthy or because science proved something wrong with them. They disappeared because fast food chains moved faster, because fewer people learned the technique at home, and because a generation of cooks who carried these recipes in their heads, never on paper, eventually retired without passing them down. That's the real story behind an empty menu category. By 1960, McDonald's had already begun expanding its franchise model at speed, and Burger King and other chains followed close behind. Those restaurants offered something diners couldn't easily match: a plate ready in under a minute at a price nobody had to think twice about. Diner lunch traffic began sliding toward that speed almost immediately, and it never really slid back. Franchised family restaurant chains followed the same pattern through the 1960s and 70s, standardizing menus across hundreds of locations at once. A dish like liver and onions or Welsh rarebit, which depended entirely on one skilled cook's judgment, simply couldn't be written into a corporate recipe card the same way a hamburger or a pancake could. Home economics classes, once a standard part of many American high schools, taught exactly the kind of cream sauce and organ meat technique these dishes required. As those classes were phased out or shrunk, starting in the 1970s and 80s, an entire generation lost formal instruction in the very skills that had kept these plates on diner menus for decades. It's not a coincidence that so many of these dishes faded at almost the same time, roughly the 1970s through the 1980s. Fast food competition, disappearing home economics instruction, and a retiring generation of diner cooks all landed within the same 20-year window, and together they emptied out a menu that had taken a century to build. The 1990s and 2000s brought a wave of diner nostalgia back into American culture: chrome trim, vinyl booths, jukeboxes, and neon signage recreated in themed restaurants across the country. But that revival almost always recreated the look of a diner, never the actual food. Burgers, fries, and milkshakes survived the nostalgia wave. Liver and onions did not. That gap between the diner aesthetic and the diner menu is really the whole reason this list exists. We kept the booths, we kept the counters, we even kept the coffee cups shaped just right. But somewhere along the way, we let the actual cooking disappear, and almost nobody noticed it happening until it was already gone. There has been a small revival worth mentioning. Food historians and a handful of chefs interested in nose-to-tail cooking have started bringing organ meats back into fine dining kitchens over the past decade, treating liver, heart, and tongue as ingredients worth real technique again. It remains a niche interest rather than a mainstream comeback, but it's real and it's growing. It's a strange kind of full circle. Dishes that once fed working-class families because they were affordable and practical are now being reconsidered by chefs, charging considerably more for the same cut of meat, prepared with the same basic techniques a diner cook once used without a second thought, decades before anyone called it fine dining. None of this is really about the food being healthier or unhealthier than what came before. These dishes vanished because of taste, convenience, and the slow disappearance of a certain kind of kitchen knowledge, not because any health authority ever raised a warning about them. That distinction matters, because it means the recipes themselves were never the problem, only forgetting them was. Surviving prefabricated diners, some of them built by Worcester Lunch Car Company nearly a century ago, are now protected as historic sites in several New England towns. Preservation groups document not just the buildings, but the menus that came with them, keeping a physical record of what those counters actually served before memory alone has to carry it. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. That phrase applies to almost everything on this list, because the techniques themselves were never lost, only set aside. A roux still thickens the same way it did in 1948. Onions still caramelize the same way. The knowledge is entirely recoverable, waiting for someone willing to stand at the stove a little longer than a recipe app usually asks. Post-war homemakers didn't have the luxury of wasting food, and that constraint, more than anything else, is what produced this entire list. Every dish we've covered today, from mock apple pie to beef heart to a savory Jell-O mold, came out of a kitchen where nothing was thrown away and every scrap had a use waiting for it. It's worth saying plainly that this wasn't a golden age with no downsides, and it wasn't a cautionary tale either. It was simply a different set of pressures producing a different set of solutions, and those solutions happened to taste good enough that millions of people ordered them week after week at counters across the entire country. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that's really the point of gathering these 15 dishes into one list. Nobody wrote a cookbook titled Forgotten Diner Food while it was still being served. It only became forgotten once the last cook who knew it by heart stopped standing behind the counter. If you sat at a counter in the 1950s and ordered any one of these 15 plates, nobody around you would have thought twice about it. That's what makes revisiting this list worthwhile now. These weren't strange or fringe foods in their own time. They were simply Tuesday lunch, and Tuesday lunch has changed more in 70 years than most of us ever stopped to notice. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and that line applies to every single dish on this list, not as a slogan, but as a literal fact. The roux, the braise, the mold, the mock filling, all of it lived in memory and muscle rather than in a printed recipe box, which is exactly why it was so easy to lose and why it still means something to recover it now. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and if there is one thing worth taking away from all 15 of these dishes, it's that forgotten does not mean gone. Every technique behind every plate we covered today is still entirely learnable, still entirely makeable, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to try it the way it was actually done. So the next time you're paging through a modern menu and everything looks the same as the restaurant down the street, remember there was a version of American eating that looked nothing like this. 15 dishes, one era, and a whole way of cooking that asked a little more of the cook and gave a little more back to the table in return. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and that's really what this channel is for. If any of these 15 dishes brought back a memory of a counter your family used to sit at, or a recipe your mother made without ever writing it down, I would love to hear it in the comments below this video. Subscribe if you want more of the food history nobody else is bothering to save, because there is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and I intend to keep digging through it one forgotten plate at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I will see you in the next one.